Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, your host, and we're back with another innovator interview in which we talk with the people and organizations taking action to address and end the climate crisis. You know, we've talked a lot on the show about carbon dioxide and carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. Today, we're joined by Josh Weber, who is the co-founder of nZero, a Nevada-based startup that tracks Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions for large organizations. Tracking emissions is the first step towards business taking responsibility for the previously unacknowledged environmental and social costs of delivering products and services. And society is just beginning to gain insights into the CO2 impacts of these organizations, governments, and individuals. It'll be some time before all of this information is widely available and commonly useful for consumers and citizens to make decisions about the products or services they buy or the government policies they support. And nZero's technology, along with those of other emerging carbon tracking tools, is a critical piece of the environmental puzzle we each need to understand. How much do we need to understand it? Well, let's look at some numbers. A study by the nonprofit USow, as in sow seeds, of the 55 largest companies in the United States found that only 3, Microsoft, PepsiCo, and Ecolab Incorporated, earned an A-level grade on their performance in terms of tracking and managing their emissions. Google and Apple received B and B- grades respectively, and most of the rest, 84% of the companies, are basically flunking out of the race to head off climate change. Carbon tracking is mostly restricted to Scope 1 and 2 emissions today, the direct and indirect emissions associated with the power used by a company. And MSCI research reported in September that only 18% of, September 2020, that only 18% of the firms it follows are reporting their Scope 3 emissions. So we'll explore why those emissions are so hard to track in today's conversation. You can learn more about nZero at nzero.com. There's no space, no dash, no nothing, just nzero.com. Welcome to the show, Josh. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here, especially from London. You're calling in. It's early in the morning where I am and in the afternoon where you are. I hope you're up for this. Look, greenhouse gas emissions are increasingly prominent features in the sustainability discussion. Let me start off with a broader question. That is, how do you think that government and business is doing in general in terms of thinking about this problem and beginning to measure it?
You know, it's a difficult question because government and business are pretty large categories.
Yes, they are.
So and also how are they doing? You know, you've got the A through F sort of ranking that you mentioned earlier, but it's much more complicated than that. So I think that, at risk of sounding like I'm equivocating, I'm not. I think that we're doing better than we were, but not nearly as well as we need to do. And, you know, that varies again by sector, by government, by company, by individual company.
Well, let me ask this, because this is really what it often comes down to. Is it profitable or money saving to understand your emissions comprehensively?
You asked lots of hard questions on this podcast. So again,
we're trying to get to the actual solutions here instead of just talking about it.
Exactly. Look,
by the way, we don't have to do it on this show.
We'll get as far as we can go, right? It's a long path, and we're all in it together. But you know, if we step back and look at it from a zoomed out macro level, there's no question that unless we get a hold of our emissions, it's going to be far more costly for all of us, right? So in a big picture, it is always cost saving to save the planet because it's, you know, as they say, the one we've got. On the other hand, if we look at every micro decision, either from a consumer's perspective or from, you know, a company that's a market participant in the economy today, until such a time as the externalities, the cost of carbon is accurately priced, then no, it's not generally going to be a way to earn money, right? It's not you're going to spend more in the short term reducing carbon than you're going to make in the short term. But again, it's a long-term look, right? It's of course cost effective in the long term to all of us. You know, a way that we look at it at nZero, rather than telling people that we're going to save you money by helping you to cut your carbon emissions, we'll say, yes, you will save some money, right? You lower your electric usage, you will in fact lower your electric bill.
Mm-hmm.
However, what we're really focused on and what we find our companies are focused on is producing the maximal impact for the money that you invest in reducing GHGs. In other words, we say, you know what, we're going to invest in doing the right thing. And the question then is, how do we get the highest carbon ROI, right? The most reduction for the dollar that we're going to invest.
So let's step back now to the broader question of what is a scope 1, scope 2, or scope 3 emission, and why in particular is scope 3 so hard to measure?
Great question. I always try to caveat that I'm not trying to oversimplify when I answer this question. But it is difficult for people sometimes, if they're not in the business and in the industry and thinking about it every day, to wrap their heads around the difference between these scopes. So put the most simply I can, I like to tell people that scope 1 is what you burn or what you emit. Mm-hmm. Scope 2 is what you directly induce somebody else to emit on your behalf. Scope 3 is emissions that you buy or sell. So to unpack those, scope 1, I turn on the burner at home tonight to cook, right? I burn gas. That's scope 1. You did it. I did it. And, if I'm a company, who knows what it is? I turn on the gas boiler or, whatever it is. I run a diesel engine. I did it. Scope 2, the other way to think about scope 2, obviously, is electricity, right? Because that makes up the overwhelming majority of scope 2. But if I flip on a light switch, at that instant, someone somewhere turns up a generator to meet the demand that I forced on the system. So that's scope 2. So what I directly induced by flipping on a switch. Mm-hmm. Scope 3, on the other hand, again, if I buy an airline ticket, I'm purchasing a service, travel, transportation. Somebody is going to emit a bunch of carbon to make that happen for me. Right. So I bought that emission in a product or service that I purchased. Likewise, downstream, if I'm a company and I'm selling a product and there are emissions associated downstream with the use of my product, well, that's scope 3 to me as well. So I purchase it, I sell it, that's scope 3.
So scope 3 is basically everything else, which makes it awfully hard to quantify since everything else is a lot. Now, your platform, it's called Ledger 8760, which is the number of hours in a year. And you changed your name from Ledger 8760 to nZero recently. But your platform reports the emissions on an hourly basis. How do you capture those scope 3 emissions? Are you placing meters and digital tracking devices all over the place? Or is this information something that you could extrapolate from power usage or mileage records?
Yeah, well, let me be a little more precise in that statement. We do hourly emissions tracking, but I should be clear, we only do hourly emissions tracking of emissions that matter on an hourly basis.
Sure, but how do you measure them?
Well, right, so depends on the scope, right? Much of the data is out there and available. There are meters on your house for your gas, right? If you have gas. So for a company, they're big meters, right? So we will get telemetry either to the meter or telemetry to the gas provider. Somebody out there holds that data that you own about your scope 1 emissions. So we create a link to whoever is holding that data on your behalf, again, be it your meter or be it your company, the person you're buying from, and we automate the intake of that data into our system. On the electric front, it's the same thing, right? Scope 2, we hook into meters if there are meters available. If it's a building management system, we can hook into a building management system. If it's the utility meter at the front door, we'll work with the utility to get that data sent to nZero. I also called it Ledger because it was a recent name change, sent to nZero on your behalf. If, and on the other hand, sometimes there are places where there's not good hourly granularity in the metering. So we also can install sub-meters. We work with partners. We're not a hardware company. So we'll work with partners to get a sub-meter in place, if that's the best way to go about getting the data. In scope 3, on the other hand, most scope 3 it's less important that there be hourly granularity about it because you're buying a thing and that data is highly attenuated, right, about the scope 1 and 2 that went into it. But your scope 3 is somebody else's scope 1 and scope 2. Probably a lot of people's scope 1 and scope 2 up the value chain from you, or again, down the value chain from you. So when we are looking for scope 3 data, depending on the type, we will, if possible, go to your supplier. That's best case scenario. And that's something that I think is the best way to do it, the future, what we need to get to, where I can go to your supplier and say, all right, what's your scope 1 and scope 2? So I can calculate the carbon, burden really of the product that I bought from you. On the other hand, we may not be able to get that data. And so in that case, you turn to using averages. And we don't like to use averages when we can avoid it. When we do use averages, we want to use the best ones. And there are many scope 3 libraries that have been built by people who are working really hard to do the science to say, what is the average carbon content of this plane ride, right? What is the average carbon content of that square meter of concrete? Now, we'd rather go and measure the individual meter of square meter of concrete. But when that's not available, we integrate with libraries to pull those factors. Then it's a matter of getting automated data about how much you used or how much you purchased, how much you sold. And then we match it to the best science about the carbon impact of that good or service.
So once an organization has that full view of their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, what can they do with that information, and how does nZero provide coaching to help them reduce their impact?
So it's just that, right? Coaching. What can you do? There's a lot of things you can do. The very first question when we onboard a customer, we usually give them a 12-month look back, maybe a 24-month look back, so they can see what they have as a baseline for the carbon emissions, carbon impacts. First question, every single time we onboard a new organization is, okay, how am I doing? And we're like, well, like I said in the beginning, better than you could be and worse than you should be, right?
At least you started is kind of, I get the sense that that is the actual answer to the questions is this journey took one step to start, but now you're on the journey.
Yes, exactly. You have started taking steps toward where you want to be. So we will typically include, sort of a light consulting service with the onboarding process. So we've got environmental science folks, data science folks. We'll take a look at the data and say, all right, well, you know what? Here's X% of your emissions are coming from this. We had one customer that had electrified some fleet and had installed, LED lights, all this before we got there. They were working hard at it, but they had these, gas heat pumps in massive cavernous buildings that were just chugging away, right? So we said, look, here's where your center of emissions really are today, as opposed to where they would have been if you hadn't taken these other steps. But then we can start doing things with the data. They want to do better. Okay, well, again, carbon ROI, that concept I mentioned earlier in the discussion. Maybe they want to put solar on the roof. Everyone likes to do that because it's cool, right? It's solar on the roof. We all like it. But if we look at their data and we start doing projections and we start looking back at their historicals and we say, well, look, you're in the desert Southwest and there is a ton of solar on during the day. And we know from our modeling that the grid is really clean during the middle of the day, relatively really clean, right? But the carbon's half what it is at night. So if you put solar on the roof, you're going to displace a little bit of relatively clean energy, right? So maybe solar isn't the best way to go. Instead, we look at the data and hey, guess what? It gets cold at night in the desert. Maybe you need to stick to focusing on energy efficiency. Right. Not really as sexy as solar panels, but it might be the way that you displace CO2 from the high carbon hours. So we do that kind of work to get them headed the right direction with these analyses. We bring in partners when we can who, are consultants who do really good work in this area and who have businesses focused there.
Now, you a moment ago, you pointed out that my scope 3 emissions is somebody else's scope 1 and 2. And your example a moment ago of the source of the energy in the Southwest is a good one. I live in the Northwest where we are almost all hydro and wind and solar now. And so I know that 98% of my electricity that I'm using is renewable.
Yep.
But can you, when you're looking at the infrastructure and extrapolating from knowing other organizations, scope 1 and 2, say, when you plug in your copy machine, this is the kind of energy you're using? Do we have that kind of insight, and do we need to start sharing scope 1 and 2 information rather than treating it as confidential information so that everybody has better access to carbon insights?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Okay.
All the long answers I gave you before. There's a good short, 3 short ones. No, you're absolutely correct. So as you know, GHGB, Greenhouse Gas Protocol, permits 2 kinds of reporting on electric, and we'll start with electric, but it gets to scope 3. It can be market-based, it can be locational. We will follow either one, because if I have a power purchase agreement, let's say I'm a large company, I'm buying power from a specific person or a specific plant.
Mm-hmm.
We will track to the actual plants that are dispatched to meet your need on an hourly basis.
Okay.
So if it is a solar plant dispatched, well, that's near zero carbon, right? On the other hand, if it's a gas plant that's being dispatched, and again, we're tracing the financial responsibility.
Sure.
When I flip that switch, who financially is responsible for turning up a generator to meet my need? So we love it when we can do market-based reporting. On the other hand, we also model the entire North American grid, and we also model Europe to understand in each location what the carbon content is of the grid on an hourly basis.
Right.
Now, the basics for starting that modeling are public, because every utility and every balancing area, right, every region is required to report what fuels were burned every single hour. Then we can go back to the EPA databases and we start cleaning up that data. But every hour we can say, you've made some copies at 5 p.m., hour ending 6 on X day. We can go back and look and say, at your location, hour ending 6, here was the approximate level of greenhouse gases emitted by that electricity.
If we have this kind of insight, I can imagine us making tremendous progress. But what are the companies that you're working with now using this data to do? Are they thinking in terms of trading carbon credits, purchasing offsets? What do you advise them to do with the data in terms of reducing that footprint?
Well, first, I mentioned before, how do I make my investments really count? Biggest carbon bang for my buck. On the other hand, you can't get there today without offsets. I mean, again, looking at scope 3 is massive, way more than my personal emissions from scope 1 and scope 2. So there are carbon offsets, there are carbon credits, there are renewable energy credits that say I was using renewable energy. All of these things can be part of the answer, but it's really critical that they be high quality. And there is a lot of question in the various quality of carbon offsets and carbon credits. It's important. I mean, you have to be a responsible actor in this situation, or you can buy really, really worthless carbon credits that aren't doing anything. So we try to work with our clients to say, what is my strategy? What's my goal? Hopefully it's nZero, right? That's why we changed our name.
Yep.
That's our goal. So then we sit down with the company and say, how quickly can we get there? What is my appetite for investment? And what are the strategies? It's going to be in all of the above, right? It's going to be some kind of offsets, most likely. It's going to be efficiency. It's going to be installing better resources, making choices about what you're willing to pay for the things that you buy.
So let me ask you a question for our listeners, which is, you're an expert in carbon tracking. How do you assess the claims being made by various companies about their carbon emissions and their environmental impact generally? What do you look for in the reporting to say, oh, they're serious, as compared to that's window dressing?
I wish that there wasn't so much window dressing, because there's a lot, right? But when I'm looking, the first thing that I want to see is, are they being complete? You have some petrochemical companies out there, big oil, right? Some who are reporting scope 1 and scope 2. Well, guess what? They're selling gasoline. Scope 3 is overwhelmingly their source of emissions. So if they're not reporting scope 1, 2, and 3, then you have to say, well, and again, I don't want to ascribe good or bad motives to anybody I don't know and don't have data about, right, on a podcast. So I'm not going to say what their motive is, but if they're not reporting scope 3, they're not trying as hard to do this as they need to do.
Okay.
The second piece, and I probably should say that a little stronger, but I was being diplomatic at the moment. Second piece, what kind of scope 3 are they doing? If they're getting to scope 3, that's a good sign. We are so thrilled when our customers are like, all right, let's tackle scope 3. Mm-hmm. Hard because it's all data from somebody else that we're trying to wrangle, but also doing a full life assessment. So, I mean, it's very rare, I think, at least in my experience in the US. In Europe, there's more and more pressure from regulators, from stakeholders, from environmental groups to say full life matters. And in full life, just in case it's helpful to define that, it's easy enough to say I got a taxi ride, that scope 3, I can figure out how much gasoline was burned. That's scope 3 gasoline, right? But that taxi I rode in, there was a tremendous amount of carbon that was emitted in the creation and manufacturing of that taxi. Right. So full life is not just the tailpipe.
Yeah, you have to amortize that embodied carbon across all the transactions using the taxi plus the fuel. It is immensely complicated.
But we've got to be trying in all the best databases where we can't do the actual, look at upstream 1 and 2. The better databases are all starting to say, let's understand full life scope 3 emissions when we do a factor to, and we're doing our reporting. So
a few minutes ago, you mentioned the idea of putting a price on carbon. And clearly that's an important lever for us to use to create the incentives and the pressure to start to make these changes in the way we make and use stuff. What do you see in terms of insights that you've developed that can help us overcome the political resistance to pricing carbon? Are there business, financial, or emotional levers we can start to pull, both with the public and with organizations?
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, scope 3 is sort of one of the tickets. If I'm thinking about scope 3, then I understand my place in this system. Because yes, that bad big oil company, right? They are selling gasoline. And we need to do something about that. But guess who's burning it?
Well, and if they actually its full life cycle footprint, we would be horrified. And it would be very difficult to go buy that gallon of gas. But
So helping individuals to understanding scope 3 helps us to see our place, because the biggest movement, and this is both encouraging and also fundamentally discouraging, right? We have some movement from the federal government now. The SEC just came out with rules. I'm very happy to say Ledger 8760 nZero is, we think, prominently in the rulemaking. Really excited about that. But the government is going slow. We have carbon tax fully implemented in California, and you can argue all day long about how effective it is or isn't. But otherwise we don't, right? So that's discouraging. But what's encouraging is so many companies and individuals are trying to price carbon today without a government agency telling them you have to do this today, right now. And the reason they're doing it, let's be honest, companies are there to make money. It's the economy. The reason they're doing it is because their customers demand it. Investors are beginning to demand it. Their boards of directors are demanding it. So, we need the public sector answer, we need the private sector answer, but we, as the people who are burning the gasoline in our cars, who are shopping for things and living in houses, and we are, we, the people, have to be driving the change. And that's that to me is difficult, but also fundamentally hopeful.
Well, and it seems to me that putting a price on carbon is the way for us to each own the responsibility. But for instance, because of the war in Ukraine, we're seeing some states lift their gas tax in order to make it less expensive to drive, and that, of course, gives everybody a pass for a period of time. Looking past these political issues, do you see any technical barriers to pricing carbon efficiently at this time? And what are they? How would we solve them if there are?
It's mass data, right? To price carbon efficiently, in a perfect world, if we knew the scope 1 and scope 2 of every actor in the economy, boy, we'd have a great data set and we'd know. So, that's part of our mission as nZero is to start bringing data so that people can really understand the cost and the impacts and make the right decisions with that full impact with the full cost in mind. But that's the biggest, I think that's the biggest single challenge is you want to implement pricing for carbon. Everybody's going to fight about the numbers.
Sure.
And that's going to give you, I mean, even you've already got political opposition, obviously, but when nobody can even agree on the numbers, now you've got a real mess if you're trying to figure out what the real cost is.
Well, and when we talk about the numbers, I think the biggest problem we suffer, and this is not just a corporate issue, it's also a government issue, is this notion everything's confidential. That if somehow you were to share your scope 1 and 2 emissions, not just your scope 3 emissions, that you would be giving away information that could hurt your business. And that seems to be one of the huge cultural blocks that we have to overcome. Is scope 3 emissions reporting competitive and confidential information that really gives you an advantage, or would it be better for it to be out there so that all of us can start to reduce our collective impact so we don't destroy the economy, so all these businesses stay profitable?
There you go, looking at the big picture. That's the right way to look at it. We need to be able to understand in this, going back to your earlier question, I probably got a bit carried away. How do we judge a company? Well, how well are they? What information are they giving about their scope 1, 2, and 3? That I can see, and my background is as an attorney in the energy field, so I can understand in some cases that companies are saying, well, we have this super competitive landscape. The price of power to me is the difference between me winning or losing against my competitors. So I can see there are places, obviously, where things like power purchase agreements clearly need to be confidential. But understanding the impact and the carbon impact, that's a different story. And the more information we have about that, the more progress we can make. I'll point to the city of Reno, one of our public customers who has been very public about what they're doing with us. They have a public portal that we work with them to keep live and have dynamic numbers in there. It's the way to go. It allows the city to say, here's how we're doing. We're going to wear our activity and we're going to be better. And, I think that's really important.
So, one of the things on your site, it's pretty basic, your site, and it would be great to see links to, for instance, Reno's reporting so that nZero becomes a conduit to people being able to understand more. How can listeners on the show follow along with what nZero is doing? How do you keep track of nZero?
Well, we love to have followers on LinkedIn, all the social media sites. You mentioned the website before. It's growing. I promise it's growing. We have a lot more information coming on. We were in stealth mode for a long time as a startup company, and we're no longer there. So we're putting a lot more information, and the website will continue to grow. So, worldwideweb.nzero.com. Absolutely. And again, the social media is a great place to follow us. And we're frankly there. It's a hot topic. We're happy to be in the news a lot right now. And the more that we and companies like us are in the news, the better it is for all of us because we're starting to get some more transparency out there.
Well, Josh, I want to thank you for taking time to talk with us today. It's been fascinating.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I appreciate the hard questions. Really, and of course, really appreciate the work you're doing here on your show.
We've been talking with Josh Weber. He is the co-founder of nZero, which you can find more about at nZero.com. That's no dash, no space, nZero.com. Folks, talking about the journey that we are all on to reduce our collective impact and each of our individual impacts as shoppers, as citizens, as companies, as governments is going to be the product of a dialogue where we share enough of this kind of information, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions information, water usage impacts. Additionally, the stuff how we treat our workers and employees all over the world comes back to an outcome that can be equitable and sustainable, but we need a dialogue. And assessing how we can each improve together is the step that we need to take. So starting this conversation with the companies or with the governments that we interact with is critical to pushing society towards the goals we need to hit. What are those goals? Well, we need to reduce our carbon footprint in the United States by 50% before 2030 is over in order to stay under the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that the UN has identified as the tipping point at which really serious, and if you don't think today's impacts on the climate are serious, we're talking about longstanding drought, reductions in food supplies, and other things that may really displace everything about our lives. So let's start the dialogue now and find a way to talk through these improvements. This is Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear. We're going to be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, please take a few minutes to share this podcast and get people thinking about their emissions, Scope 1, Scope 2, and asking about their employers and other companies' Scope 3 emissions. We're going to be back soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.